people to leave that behind. So we're talking about mass leaving or decommissioning of your old religion. That's part one. And part two is a humanist confirmation. So you don't have to have been part of a religion to be part of that. You can say, yes, I'm a humanist officially. So we can all be part of that event. That's going to be part of a fundraiser for the River City Resources. So if you're interested in that, drop us an email. I'll keep a list. If you're a former Mormon, let me know. And if you have ideas for what your ceremony might be, let us know and we'll keep a record. Yeah.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Catherine. Much appreciated. Executive members, anything I forgot? Anything that I haven't mentioned? I think we're good.
Anybody has questions, just put your hand up if you're on the exec. There you
Todd, Sherry, Helen, Dorothy, Norm, me.
go. If you have questions, ask one of us, or if in doubt, just contact, like, the email on the website. Whatever.
Yeah, please do. Or if you're on Facebook, we're all over the web. We're on Meetup, we're on Facebook. We're on Facebook so much, we drank the Kool-Aid. Honestly, it's multiple times a day we're checking it. But anyway, if there is no more business, I am pleased and thrilled to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. He did ask us for no long introduction or formal titles or anything like that. He's our friend Arthur. But I do have to share the one thing I did find out in the last couple of days. The man has his own Wikipedia page. How impressive is that? He does. And it's not just a stub either. It is a full page. So we are thrilled to have Premier Ethicist with us this evening, Dr. Arthur Schafer. Oh, before you begin, we have one important question for you.
And don't forget to press the button.
I did already. Humane Society. You're giving a talk for them about ethics in animals?
Yes.
Did they tell you where?
Gosh.
It's not in their newsletter. If you don't know off the top of your head, we'll find out. But
I don't, I'm sorry.
okay. Because we got our newsletter and we were all excited. And we said,
It's in
Arthur,
June, isn't it?
Yeah. June 24th.
Yeah, I got this letter.
Guess you'll have to find out where it is.
They haven't
So
told
we're
me.
done with the last minute.
This reference just a moment ago to rituals, ceremonies, and the word confirmation was mentioned. A couple of weeks ago, I flew to Toronto for the confirmation of my goddaughter. I'm an atheist. Her mother is a Catholic atheist. and someone I love. We for I suppose almost 20 years we've been involved in she's one of Canada's most famous whistleblowers. I'd love to see her on our coinage or see her face on the dollar bill. At all events, we became friends through a struggle for research integrity in medicine. And here I found myself as someone's godfather. It's a bit of a shock. I should send her to you to find a better ceremony.
Arthur, the current term is guide parent, or
Oh, I
guide
see.
father, or guide
Well,
mother.
I somehow got stuck in as a godfather,
Yeah.
which sounds slightly unsavory and illegal as well. I don't know how I got my topic this evening. It wasn't the one I suggested. And indeed I can't actually remember what it is. I mean, what you've been told, but what I want to talk about, and I hope it's in the neighborhood. If I've drawn you here on fraudulent premises, I apologize in advance. It wouldn't be the first time. I want to talk about the ethics of belief. And yes, the topic you were given, that purportedly I'm going to address, is whether it's ethical to persuade someone out of their religion. I want to talk about something more basic, whether it's ethical to be religious. And I'm going to argue that it isn't.
Sorry, I missed that.
I'm going to argue that it isn't ethical to be religious, that it's unethical to believe in God or religion or horoscopes or signs of the zodiac or a whole bunch of other things. Now, not many people would make that claim. Mostly people think, well, look, if you want to be religious, you have a right, moral right to believe whatever you want as long as you don't try to impose it on other people. There shouldn't be prayers in public gatherings. We still have prayers, I'm told, in the legislature before they begin. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Prayers to God. How? Despite a recent Supreme Court case, I wonder why we have civil liberty, Manitoba Association of Rights and Liberties, or the humanists, perhaps in combination, haven't challenged the legality of this. My point isn't a legal one. I want to talk about ethics, and I want to argue that it's unethical to be superstitious. It's unethical to believe for anyone to believe anything on the basis of inadequate evidence. That's where I'm going to end up. I'm going to start somewhere else. And by the way, so it would follow, if I'm right, that of course it's ethical to persuade someone to give up their religion, because it's not ethical for them to be religious in the first place, if I'm right. Let me start with, actually, as I was sitting at the table, it occurred to me that one good place to start would be 1970 with the War Measures Act. Some of you were old enough to have been politically conscious in 1970. It was my first year back after a number of years of living and doing research and studying as a graduate student in England. And I was invited to, after the passage of the War Measures Act, there was a rally in downtown, in Memorial Park, it's called, against the War Measures Act, organized by civil libertarians. I'm not sure if I need to say this, but perhaps I will. Civil liberties were suspended across Canada. So it was illegal, for example, to publish the FLQ manifesto, although it was published by the student newspaper at the University of Manitoba, the Manitoban. They not only published it, they published the Manitoban in a huge edition, many extra thousands of copies, and they distributed them downtown. No one was arrested. There was a bookstore in Osborne Village called the Dimension Bookstore, which had a poster in its window that read "Vive l'FLQ," and the RCMP came and took it down. So it was one serious encroachment on freedom of speech, which was suspended. In Quebec, hundreds and hundreds of people were imprisoned under the provisions of the War Measures Act, including many poets, novelists, writers, singers, theater people. Not one was ever charged with any offense, but they were kept in prison, some of them for months and months, for 90 days, the legislation permitted, and then it could be renewed for another 90 days. So they were smeared, many of them lost employment, all of them were deprived of family and so on, and not one was ever charged. This was Canada's terrorism scare of 1970. At all events, I gave a lecture to this rally in Memorial Park. And the CBC happened to be there covering it. And I was on the national television news that night saying critical things about this unwarranted, in my view, suspension of civil liberties right across the country, in Quebec, but also from coast to coast. That night, Saturday night, Pierre Laporte was murdered. Two people had been kidnapped. The British consul and a minister in the Quebecois government. And the minister in the government, Pierre Laporte, was murdered on Saturday night. Well, anxiety levels and so 2 kidnappings, 1 murder. There must be dozens of murders and dozens of kidnappings every weekend in Montreal, but these 2 were political, and they shocked people. There were editorials in the Free Press denouncing me. There was a very right-wing columnist who denounced me as a friend of terrorism. There was a campaign to have me fired. This is the key point I want to make. It was Pierre Trudeau's most popular moment of his career. In Parliament, every Liberal voted in favor of the War Measures Act. Remember, this is legislation. It was meant to suspend civil liberties in the case of the dire emergency of a war. An apprehended insurrection. The country's going to rise up. Every Liberal voted in favor, and every Conservative except one, a man called David MacDonald, voted against. And all the New Democrats voted against. It was their least popular moment and Trudeau's most popular moment. 10 years later, it was difficult to find, on the 10th anniversary of the War Measures Act, it was difficult to find anyone, even the Free Press had an editorial saying, what an unwarranted, wrong-headed invasion of civil liberties, this suspension of civil liberties this was. There was absolutely no justification for it. At the time, in 1970, John Turner, who was then Minister of Justice, said to the Canadian people, trust us, we have good evidence, good reasons which we can't reveal to you. And Canadians believed. What really strikes me, and the reason I'm starting with this story, is how gullible we were. There was a campaign to have me fired. My parents were insulted and abused because their son was defending terrorism. Actually, my argument was that the police could do perfectly well at catching those responsible for these criminal acts, and that I couldn't see any need to suspend freedom of speech or to imprison people without charging them. If there was evidence, people could be charged and put on trial. As I say, no one was ever charged, so they just rounded up people and imprisoned them. And it was hugely popular. And that kind of stuck with me. How thin the veneer of civilization in Canada was. How easily, I mean, what if our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, were to declare an apprehended Muslim insurrection, suspend civil liberties and shut down all critics and imprison people without trial?
Just did.
Well, yeah, it's kind of, you're thinking of Omar Khadr, but he wasn't, the Conservatives didn't do the decent thing by getting him out of Guantanamo, but it was the Americans that imprisoned him. I mean, you have to be charged in Canada. If you're a Canadian citizen, you can't. It's called habeas corpus. We just celebrated the anniversary of the Magna Carta. The Great Charter that said no one, not even the king, can imprison people without telling them why and allowing them to be tried before a jury of their peers. So Canadians, overwhelming, including many of my colleagues in the Faculty of Law, I was sort of looking around, where were all the Liberals to come to my defense? They didn't. The Chief Justice of Manitoba was a famous civil libertarian, and a friend of mine went to Ottawa and gave a televised speech defending the government. I won't go through the names of all the civil libertarians who turned out in this moment of crisis, to disappear, but people were afraid. Fear is a tremendous asset when it comes to civil liberties. Make people afraid and they will follow the most authoritarian, the most oppressive measures. The point I want to extract from this story, and I'm now going to switch to a totally different example, and then I'm going to present the argument behind it. But the point I want to make is that when people are credulous, when they're willing to believe things without evidence, if there's going to be an insurrection in Canada, an uprising, it's going to overthrow the government, there'll be factories shutting down. There'll be it happened in May of '68 in France. Students took over their lycée, red flags were flying over the Fiat, Peugeot factories, the automobile factories. There were hundreds of thousands of workers marching in the street. There really was a danger of insurrection. They didn't suspend civil liberties in France, by the way. Here we had, let me say it again, 2 kidnappings and 1 murder. And Canadians accepted that we should hand over our civil liberties and made our Prime Minister the most popular person in Canada for some time. Until, as I say, 10 years later, people were aware that there was no evidence. So the point I want to make is that if citizens, if as a community, if as a society, we're gullible, we'll believe things without good evidence. And I'm going to bring this discussion around to religion shortly. It's really dangerous. It's perhaps the most serious weakness in the fabric of society is a citizenry which isn't critical, questioning, skeptical, and which doesn't demand evidence, justification for the actions and the policies of its government and its elites. Okay, that was 1970. I want to switch to events, a couple of events related that happened and in which I was involved just recently, within the last 6 months, a little more than 6 months, depending on when you start the story. There were two young First Nations girls. We know the name of one. Her name is Michaela Salt. She's now dead. The other was called in the court JJ. JJ is still alive. They both had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a kind of childhood leukemia that, in the case of JJ, the medical evidence was that 95% of the children, almost all of the children who have this, can be cured with chemotherapy. And her mother and Michaela Salt's mother both started their daughters, I think they were between 12 and 14 years of age, started them on chemotherapy, and the kids became sick. Chemo is highly toxic, it's poisonous. They became very sick, and both mothers had listened to a talk given by a man from a fast-talking con man from a clinic in Florida called the Hippocrates Clinic. He purported to offer medical treatment and said that he could cure them with positive thinking, raw fruits and vegetables, and vitamin injections. And as JJ's mother said in court, he was very confident, presented his natural cure very confidently, and so they discontinued, both mothers discontinued the leukemia for their daughters. The Hippocrates Clinic, which is, by the way, a licensed massage parlor, charged each family $18,000, which money they raised. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Michaela, who was pronounced cured by the clinic, is now dead. And the story about JJ got more complicated. At all events, her case went to court. The Halton County Children's Aid Society. Let me take a step back. I've been involved in a number of cases with Jehovah's Witness parents who've refused blood transfusions for their children in circumstances where, with a blood transfusion, the child's life could be saved, and without it, the child's life would almost certainly be forfeit. And when the parents refuse blood transfusions, the hospital applies to the court for an order making the child, for this appointing the child a guardian ad litem. Usually it's a social worker who, for the purpose of medical care, will be the child's guardian. And the social worker then looks at the evidence for and against the medical procedure which the parents are refusing. And if the social worker thinks that the child's best interests are served by the blood transfusion, the court has given the social worker the power to order it, and the child's life is saved. Once you're 18, once you're legally an adult, you have the right to refuse any treatment whatsoever. You have a bacterial infection and you refuse an antibiotic that will save your life, no one can force you to take the antibiotic. You suffer a respiratory collapse and need a respirator or a ventilator to breathe. If you say no, no one can force treatment on you. But we see children whose parents make wildly irrational decisions as being in need of care and protection. See that as the duty of society, to protect them against the wildly irrational or sometimes the unloving decisions of their parents. At all events, the Children's Aid Society of Halton County in Hamilton refused to apply to the court for a care and protection order for either Michaela Salt or JJ. And the hospital went to court, and the judge found against them. The judge agreed that on the evidence, JJ's life was in peril if the chemotherapy wasn't resumed. But he said traditional First Nations rights, these were First Nations children, traditional First Nations rights, such as hunting and fishing rights. If you've traditionally hunted or fished in a certain area, the government can't deprive you of those rights. So he argued that First Nation that they had a right to First Nations medicine in the same way that they had a traditional First Nations medicine, in the same way that they had a traditional right to hunting and fishing. To me, that verdict made no sense. First of all, no one was denying them First Nations medicine. If they had wanted to say prayers or do smudging or whatever, or take herbs or whatever the traditional First Nations, no one was denying them that. The issue is whether they should, by their mothers or by their families, be denied access to chemotherapy, which 95 times out of 100 will save the life of a child, and the child will have a normal, healthy life with a normal life expectancy. So that was the issue, and the judge ruled against the hospital. It's the only case in Canadian history, at least the only one of which I'm aware, in which the deciding question was not what's in the best interest of the child. Because the answer to that was clear. The best interest of the child were in both children, but JJ was the case that went to court. Her best interests were to have her life saved. She didn't think so. And her mother didn't think so. The mother was loving and wanted the best for her daughter, and the chemo made her terribly, terribly sick, as it often does. And the mother believed this fast-talking charlatan from the Hippocrates clinic. by the way, I'll just sort of, as an addendum, mention the initial treatment with chemo put the leukemia, put JJ's leukemia into remission, and the mother agreed that she would take her daughter back periodically to be tested, and when the cancer came back, the hospital and lawyers and First Nations leaders and spiritual leaders got together and they decided that she would indeed go back on chemo, and she's getting chemo now. And the judge came back to court and did something again which I don't think it's ever been done in Canadian history. He called it a clarification. And the clarification, which was really a complete reversal of his judgment, was that the interests of the child should come first. In his judgment, he'd said it was for constitutional right of First Nations people. At all events, I see myself as a very strong supporter of First Nations rights, traditional rights, and not just traditional rights, because communities change over time, and I think we ought to protect the rights even as they change and become more modern. So I'm in favor of but I don't think the life of First Nation, as a result of the initial judgment, First Nations children were the only children in Canada whose lives weren't protected against the wildly irrational decision of their parents. Every other child, if your parent makes a wildly irrational decision, the courts will intervene and appoint a guardian, and the evidence will be looked at. So the point I want to draw from this case is the same point I wanted to draw from the War Measures Act. I mean, two totally different cases, but they're both cases where, in the one case, a whole society seems to have lost its ability to think critically and reasonably and assess the evidence. And in the case of Michaela Salt and JJ, the parents, naive, unsophisticated, were easily taken in by a medical charlatan. And the result of that was the death of Michaela Salt. I accuse the Halton County Children's Aid Society and the authorities of her death. It was entirely preventable. She need not have died. But if the parents had been better educated, if they'd been more skeptical, if they'd been more critical, if they hadn't been so easily taken in by a glib salesman who said, "Oh, I can cure your daughters, give me $18,000, it'll be carrot juice, it'll be vitamin injections, it'll be positive thinking, and hey presto, they'll be fine." And I don't necessarily blame them, but in a way I do blame them. Because if you allow yourself to believe what you want to believe what makes you comfortable, without testing the evidence, you're like a walking time bomb. You can vote for fascism or Nazism or any other kind of ideology, or with respect to your own health or that of your family, you can make decisions that are just wildly irrational, that ignore the evidence. So, and again, I'm kind of foreshadowing the conclusion to which I'm going to gradually, inch by inch, make my way. I don't know. Does any of you? Do you know what your sign of the zodiac is? Do you ever look up your horoscope? Okay, so my argument is that by allowing yourself to be superstitious, maybe you find it amusing, entertaining. I know people who, one of my ex-wives believed in tarot cards. there are people who make important life decisions on this basis. Their lives can be forfeit because of their gullibility, their credulity, their promiscuity when it comes to the ethics of belief. They're willing to believe things for which there isn't good scientific evidence. So it's not just a matter of, and again I want to develop this argument in several tranches, but it's not just a matter of, okay, if I want to believe in horoscopes, that's my decision, because first of all, when you believe something that's irrational, something for which there's no good evidence, you can't just isolate that belief. You'll then believe other things that are similar to it, and other things that are similar to that. And in the end, you become a certain kind of person. The kind of person who, when Harper says, Prime Minister Harper says there's a real danger of terrorism in Canada, but your chances of getting hit by lightning are hundreds of times greater than your chances of being killed or injured by terrorists in Canada. It's a non-existent threat, and yet it may get him re-elected because Canadians may be insufficiently critical, insufficiently capable of critical thinking and weighing the evidence to form a judicious judgment. There's a story that's shared by almost everyone who's religious, that pictures the universe as a kind of harmonious, ordered cosmos with created according to a blueprint designed and created by a benevolent, all-loving God, as a place for we humans to inhabit. And there is some evidence of harmony in the universe, but there's massive evidence of disharmony. More of us are starving and in pain and discomfort, threatened and homeless than are comfortable. The amount of pain and suffering, even in Canada, never mind in Bangladesh or the favelas of Brazil or Nigeria, is massive. The amount of cancer and mental illness and mosquitoes and floods and droughts, and the idea that this world was created by an all-loving deity is, boy, you wouldn't have to think for long or notice very much in the world before you'd say that's not a very plausible hypothesis. Indeed, if the hypothesis were that the world was created by an all-hating God with the design of making our lives as miserable as they can be, well, that hypothesis might be more plausible than the first hypothesis, the harmonious universe hypothesis. Now, the alternative view to this religious worldview, the religious worldview says the orderliness of the universe, the fact that it's a cosmos, comes about by design. And it's the design of a benevolent designer, an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God. The biological, or Darwinian if you prefer, explanation is that as a result of natural selection and the playing out of certain forces, there is the appearance of design. Organisms that through mutation survive better in the environment tend to survive and multiply, and those that are less well fitted die out. And so you've got a kind of natural adaptation. The environment is always changing, and those thousands, tens of thousands of species go extinct, and we may be on the way to extinction ourselves. The non-religious view of the universe says that the universe basically, essentially consists of atoms bouncing around in the void. It's not a warm, harmonious, friendly place created for us by a loving being. It's very different from that. There is no purpose out there, no meaning. Now, if you put that view forward, that there's no meaning out there, it doesn't mean that the universe is meaningless, by the way. It means that we've got the challenge of creating meaning in our lives, of finding purposes, in my view, I'm not going to develop this strand of the argument. In my view, one of the best ways of making your life meaningful or purposive is to try to reduce suffering a little bit in the world, try to make the world a little less terrible, and a little easier and more comfortable for people who are at the moment in big trouble. But if you had to choose between these two views of the world, the harmonious, purposive, kind, gentle view of the world, and the random chance, natural selection, the universe as a chaos rather than a cosmos, most people, I think, would find it more comfortable, and do find it more comfortable, to believe in the loving God hypothesis. Gives meaning to my life. It's comforting. My child dies of cancer. I believe that she's being called to the heavenly choir by a loving God, and she's gone to a better place. She didn't die, she passed. And I personally don't find that story comforting, but millions, tens of millions, hundreds of people do find it comforting. My argument is that to believe something because it makes you feel good, because it gives you comfort, is unethical. It's morally wrong. It's morally wrong because your reason for believing is not that you've got evidence, reason, justification. It's because it makes you feel good. And there are lots of things that may make you feel good that may turn out to be very dangerous for other people. Going back then, I think that think about the most seriously antisocial events in which a citizen might engage. You steal money from others, you defraud them, you commit violent assaults, you rob, violence, theft, robbery, deception. In a way, you're more of a danger to society. This is my argument. If you're religious than if you're a thief. Because the religious person has to make herself or himself willing to believe something because it makes them feel good, gives them comfort. But then what follows from that? You become a certain kind of person, a person who admits beliefs that make you feel good even when there's no evidence for them. Well, societies in which there is persecution of minorities, racism, discrimination, purges, almost all find this persecution and this violence and this hatred based on false beliefs. The Jews have dangerously impure blood. They are Untermenschen, subhuman. They betrayed Germany in the First World War. Africans are like monkeys. They're like children. They're incapable of self-determination. You pick the nationality and find the racist stereotype, and what you'll invariably find is that the people who believed it haven't looked at the evidence, because there's no evidence for any of these racist beliefs. So irrationality, gullibility, credulity, all relate to the ethics of belief. And the thesis I want to put before you is one I take from a mid-19th century British writer called William Clifford, Clifford. And Clifford is the one who argued that it's wrong for everyone to believe anything without good evidence. That it's morally wrong. It's not just bad epistemology, bad science, it's bad ethics. Because when you believe, and even those of us, it's not just Ronald Reagan's wife consulted an astrologer, and he believed whatever his wife told him. He was a kind of simple guy. Well, that astrologer could have led the world into a thermonuclear holocaust. So when our leaders are irrational, there's a kind of terrifying danger to all of society, maybe all of humanity. But it's not just our leaders, it's every one of us. Because if we're irrational, then we may end up with our own children or those we love or our neighbors doing things or failing to do things based on our irrationality or on our willingness to believe things without good evidence. We may do things that cause great harm to ourselves or worse, to other people. The ignorance and superstition of these two First Nations mothers, JJ's mother and Michaela Salt's mother, through terribly bad luck, meant that Michaela Salt is dead when she could be alive. And JJ could have died, but fortunately it looks as if, now that she's back on chemo, she's got a good chance of living. So it's the next time somebody says to you, oh, you're a Gemini, are you? I'm a Taurus, or I hope I've got the right names for signs of the zodiac. I don't read horoscopes. I think it's wicked that newspapers carry them. I think it's dangerous. Makes me sound absolutely humorless, I know. But it's dangerous because it's encouraging people to accept, intellectually to accept a way of looking at the world that makes all of us vulnerable to con men, charlatans, exploitative, oppressive individuals, and to our own desire to believe certain things because it makes our lives feel better. Okay. I'm about to shift somewhat. I've been speaking as if you either believe or you don't believe, as if there's a kind of toggle switch, on-off, belief and non-belief. But actually, for most things in life, we have to act. We have to make choices and decisions, and we don't have conclusive evidence. Should I'm going out with this woman, she's very attractive, she laughs at my jokes. I think she's Ms. Right, but am I sure? Well, no, I'm not sure she's Ms. Right. If I wait until I'm absolutely certain, I'll probably never be in a committed relationship because I'll never be sure. What kind of career should I pursue? Should I be a doctor or a lawyer or, God help us, a university professor, a landscape gardener? I mean, well, I'm not sure. If I wait until I'm sure, should I have surgery for my prostate cancer? I won't even have the PSA test. I won't go for a checkup, for a medical checkup. Now, the reason I won't go is that I've looked at the evidence. The evidence is that that if you don't have symptoms and you're having these tests just to see if there might, to have your cholesterol tested, or if you're a man of a certain age, you have the digital rectal exam to see if your prostate is enlarged, and if it feels enlarged, then you have the PSA test, the prostate-specific antigen test, and if that's positive, it means that perhaps you have prostate cancer. And then you can have a prostatectomy, and you can have adjuvant radiation therapy. Now, I've looked at the evidence, and the evidence suggests that you can probably, for every 200 men who have the test, you can perhaps save a life. But 40 or 50 men who test positive it'll either turn out to be a false positive, they didn't really have cancer, or the cancer wouldn't have done them any harm anyway. Almost every man who lives to 80 or 90 has prostate cancer. It's what you die with, not what you die from. And the surgery, the prostatectomy, renders, if one life is saved from 200, the prostatectomy might render 40 men incontinent and impotent. So you lose your sex life and you need to wear a diaper. Well, if you investigated, you knew those were the odds, you might still opt to have the test. Or you might say, you know what, only 1 in 200 is going to benefit. Large numbers are going to be harmed. Maybe I prefer to take the risk that I'll be the 1 in 200 whose life could have been saved. Catching it early, by the way, almost the same reasoning applies to mammography. So I don't want to provide an example that applies to men and not one that applies to women. It turns out that breast screening, if your mom and your aunt died from breast cancer and your sister, there's a good reason to have mammography. But if there's no dramatic history in your family, the mammographies end up with a lot of false positives, a lot of women who are terrified. Catching it early turns out, counterintuitively, what the evidence shows is that the tumor you catch early may be so lethal that it kills you anyway. You don't live any longer by catching it early. Or it wouldn't have harmed you anyway, so catching it early doesn't matter because it wasn't going to harm you. And there may be a few people who benefit and lots of people who are harmed, and is it a good idea? We're talking about screening tests now, not people who have symptoms. So, if you base your view on what kind of medical treatments to get, if we were more rational and skeptical, if our doctors were more rational and skeptical, they're not very rational and they're not very skeptical. And most of the evidence in the medical journals is really pseudo-evidence, and what our physicians practice is pseudo-evidence-based medicine. Almost all the studies are almost all of them turn out to be unreliable. They're almost all funded by the drug companies. The studies that don't show their products are good are buried, they aren't published. Even the ones that show they are good turn out to be, they exaggerate the benefits, they minimize the harms. I have dozens of books on my shelves, and there's now a whole literature accumulating that's highly skeptical about modern medicine, which is really commercial, marketplace-driven, medical industry-driven research, or so-called research. And our doctors are funded in a way and bought off and bribed by and paid much more if they practice one kind of medicine rather than another. So I want to go back to Michaela and JJ and their mothers. I'm deeply skeptical of chemotherapy. it may sound as if I'm contradicting myself here, and I hope the point I'm trying to make will become clear in a moment. If I had metastatic cancer, if I had cancer that had spread, I very much doubt that I would have chemo. I did a program on The Current last year on families who are desperate to get a hold of these drugs that haven't been licensed yet, they haven't been approved, they cost $30,000, $40,000, $60,000, $80,000, and the cancer has spread and they're desperate, they want to live longer. Most of these drugs, even the ones that are licensed and shown to be effective, the effectiveness is that you live an extra few weeks or maybe a few months and you're sick as a dog. Given that choice, I would say, for me, you'd have to make your own decision. I'd say take a pass on the drugs. Go home, die at home rather than in the hospital. Get palliative care so that you're comfortable. Say, have a quiet, calm, peaceful end of your life with your family rather than getting an extra month or two when you're puking your guts out and you've got diarrhea and you're not feeling nausea all the time and your head is giddy so you can't read or think. Might not be your choice. So in a way, I'm partly agreeing with the mothers. They said, well, JJ's mother was quoted in the media saying, this is poison. It is. Chemo is poison. It's highly toxic. Now, in the case of JJ, the evidence was really strong that it was worth taking it despite how wretched it made her feel, because it was almost certain that it would save her life and she'd live a long and normal and healthy life once the leukemia was cured. So in that case, I favored intervention by the courts to ensure that the well-being of the children was preserved. In many other cases, I wouldn't be an advocate of chemo. Look, life is kind of complicated. And there's often a lot of uncertainty. There are bound to be people in this room who either you or your loved ones, your family, your parents are facing difficult decisions, and you don't have much knowledge. Now, I'm almost ready to wrap up and take your questions, comments, and criticisms. People don't like uncertainty. It's so much, life goes so much easier and we feel so much more comfortable if, let's stick with the medical setting. Your doctor says, here's the diagnosis, here's the recommendation, here's the prescription, hands it to you, you walk out, and the doctor feels good, by the way. I've seen the evidence of psychological testing of the doctors. They feel really good when they've written the prescription and done something. And the patient feels good, and moreover, when the doctor writes the prescription, that's the kiss-off. The patient leaves, you get a new patient in. You can see a lot of patients if you write a lot of prescriptions. If you sit and talk and listen to their problems and try to figure out what's wrong, you'll see many fewer patients, and we pay by them. It's kind of in the industrial model. The more patients you see, the more money you get. So it's in everyone's interest. The patients like it, the doctors like it, and millions and millions of prescriptions are written. And if you're an elderly person, you're taking 12 different drugs. Many of them drugs to counteract the side effects of the drugs, which were taken to counteract the side effects of the other drugs. And it's just one of the many huge scandals. The point I want to make is, how would you feel if you came in with a problem and the doctor said, you know what? We'll run some tests. We ran some tests. I looked at the results. I'm not at all sure what's wrong. I don't know. Could be this, could be this, could be this, could be something else. So let's try watching and waiting for a while. The greatest Canadian physician who ever lived was a man called William Osler. He was also the greatest American physician, the greatest British physician, because he lived and worked in all of these countries. And there's a William Osler school here, and I studied in England. There was a William Osler house attached to the college at which I was doing research and teaching. He was associated with the view that that if you're a physician, you shouldn't just do something, you should stand there. The idea that doing something, okay, here's the diagnosis, here's what I'm going to do. And it's not just in medicine, in life generally, people living with uncertainty is a challenge for us. So when the con man comes along and is confident and tells you, okay, here's the cure, or here's what you should do, or here's where you should invest your money, the more confident they seem. Go back to JJ's mom. He was really confident. Well, we like confident people. And I think it's to our detriment. I think we need to figure out how to live with uncertainty. And some of the time, I think we are forced to make decisions when we won't have certainty, in which case, we can't always wait until you've accumulated all the evidence. There's some decisions that have to be made, otherwise you forfeit the opportunity. In which case, you get the best evidence you can, you make the decision, but if you can, you keep looking for more confirmation, and you stay open to disconfirmation, to disproof that you hope you're on the right track, but you've got to be aware and alert that you might not be. Can you live with uncertainty? I want to put a question mark. How would you feel if your physician said to you, I'm not sure what's wrong, or I think I know what's wrong, but I'm not sure which the best treatment is, and maybe we should wait and watch. Would you switch physicians and go to someone else, or would you say, oh, what a relief. He's honest, he's telling me what he really believes, and I'm willing to live with uncertainty. Most people want decisive action, I think. I want to raise one final point. Can we live with the truth? Some people who say if the universe is godless, if there is no purpose, then I'm going to go out and rape and kill and steal. If God is dead, then ethics is dead. What a condemnation of someone to think that they need this superstition, this almost certainly false belief, in order to persuade them. But I want to raise a broader point. Can we live life without comforting illusions? Your partner or your lover tells you that you're just, the most wonderful lover she's ever had. Would you really? Your colleagues say that your research, your articles are fabulous. They're brilliant. Do you really want to know that they're laughing at you behind your back? That you're inadequate in bed? That you're... we all cherish illusions about ourselves. That we're better than we really are, that people like and respect and love us more than they do, that the universe is real, that everything's going to work out okay. We big ourselves up. Are you impressed with my connection to contemporary culture? I'm impressed that I could use that phrase. We inflate our self-esteem, and as parents we do that with our kids. Instead of saying, well, that was okay, you're singing in the school. I went to a concert yesterday, school concert. It was pretty awful. But I was bored out of my skull, but I didn't say that. And when someone says, does my bum look fat in this? Well, crikey, nobody would say yes. So we do. We live with a lot of illusions and a lot of lies, and yet, I know that there are a few great soul, noble human beings who can live in the truth, who don't need to fool themselves and won't be fooled by others. Can most ordinary people live confronting the truth questioning, critical, skeptical. Can most of us live with a lot of uncertainty? Facing the uncertainty in our lives, uncertainty about our health, uncertainty about our competence. I mean, most women doubt that feel that they're frauds in their jobs. And actually most men do too, but women talk to each other about the inadequacies they feel. And men seldom admit to each other that they feel fraudulent, or that they don't really feel that they're up to scratch in what they're doing. I just wonder, and I put this out again with a question mark, how much truth can ordinary